Ducksons&Dragoon. One. Quest for the holy snail. Duck. So hard. Hi. Hi.
Chapter 29A 101 Akingolinian Nights, written by Ming Zun, Outside of Time. Story number 7, Teenage Mutant Rodent Nights. Once upon a time, way too long ago, Bifford and Rodrigo had set out together to explore the shady fir forest on the horizon. Legends in the field mouse realms were that two armies of man had fought a battle with severe losses there centuries ago, in which almost all soldiers of both sides had fallen. Hence the name, Funereal Forest. As so often during the summer, the two unequal companions had been given the day off from homeschooling to observe the events out there in nature. Armed with a knapsack of provisions and swords made of hazel sticks, they must surely have been wandering for a full hour through the flat pastureland that surrounded Mr. Crownswood Sr.'s mansion. At their back, even further away than the manor house, was the chain of hills overgrown with low thicket. They had just squeezed through a dense hedge and a wall of brambles to continue marching straight toward the funereal forest. Now, as they walked through a golden undulating field of wheat, Bifford said to Rodrigo, "I wonder what awaits us on this fantastic adventure. Traveling with you, dear Rodrigo, is always extremely exciting and unpredictable." Rodrigo the mouse usually traveled in a small cage, but he also walked a fair distance on his own. In their imagination there was no difference between mouse and human, so they walked side by side and always spoke to each other at eye level. But now Bifford paused, thoughtful. "Always a pleasure, Senor Bifford. The loot is not to be scoffed at either. Supplies are piling up and our good reputation is well known in the region." The now human-sized, upright walking mouse said contentedly. Rodrigo also stopped and turned around to his human companion. Bifford Crownswood said hesitantly, "Yes, it's just back there. The hedge we just climbed through. I've never been so far from home. Maybe we should set up markers so we can find our way back." But Rodrigo the mouse could only laugh at such a half-hearted suggestion. With the backhand of his plate glove, he hit Bifford's chest armor lightly, so that it rattled metallically, laying a trail of cookie crumbs like little Girl Scout who have lost their way to school. "Never. We are men of battle, amigo. We will fight our way and break through successfully. The trail of the slain enemies and mythical creatures will then lead us back." Rodrigo promised confidently and full of thirst for adventure. He tore off a stalk of wheat and stuck it in the corner of his mouth to chew on. "Come, Senor Bifford. Don't forget the map I bought at the midnight market of the mice while you were indulging in sleep. It will definitely be worth the try." So they moved on and finally, after another hour, reached the edge of the funereal forest. There was nothing there but dark, shady fir trees and no one knew what was hidden inside. Wandering spirit apparitions, scorpion nests, decaying castle ruins or a sorcerer's magical dungeon. Possibly nothing at all. The two companions sat down on a bench, which must have been built by unknown adventurers who had already explored the funereal forest before Bifford and Rodrigo. They shared an apple, a hard piece of cheese, and a few slices of sour black bread with sunflower seeds. When their short picnic had ended, they studied the map once more and then entered the forest that loomed silently behind them. The location noted on the rough paper was farther east and on the far side of the wooded strip of land. They walked side by side in silence, looking around and making their way through the scarce undergrowth. The dark branches of the fir trees and the soft ground muffled the sound of their footsteps, and the companions made good progress on the intersecting game paths. Bifford was no longer the black-haired, pale, and frail boy, and Rodrigo was no longer the cute little white mouse. They were adult, well-trained, and independent journeyman adventurers. Soon the small slopes in the terrain of the forest became ranges of unexplored hills and a medium-sized boulder turned into a huge rock formation. The small overgrown pond became a vast, impassable swamp region, and the trees became a city of skyscrapers where millions of people could live together under one roof. Bifford gazed in amazement at the wonders that his imagination presented him with, here, in the dark, silent forest, where nothing and no one distracted him from dreaming and brought him back to reality. Eventually Rodrigo stopped and pointed ahead to a brook running along in a ditch, some ferns and a waist-high boulder. There, Senor Bifford. Do you see that massive rock formation up ahead in the insurmountably wide canyon? Next to it, at the bottom of the valley, I can make out a little bamboo grove in the semi-darkness. Precisely as sketched on the map. Bifford took the folded map out of his knapsack and indeed everything matched. Not far anymore. They followed the canyon upstream on a narrow path, keeping on this higher level, to the right side of the watercourse. They were now almost in the heart of the funereal forest, where the evergreen fir trees were so dense that the sunlight could hardly penetrate to the ground. But neither the darkness nor the growing unease would be able to stop the two companions. Probably the spirits of the fallen would only roam the forest at night, anyway. Bravely they quickened their pace and now hurried along the straight animal trail. Until they heard a rustling splashing from afar and a little later saw the shadow of a steep rock face towering in front of them. They walked towards the sound and, as promised on the map, spotted among the other tree trunks a very special one on their right-hand side. A well-trodden path branched off and led between the fir trees. The tree they had been looking for had grown on a little mound and was struck by lightning a long time ago. Only a charred stump protruded from the ground, its roots still clawed into the ground like a grasping hand. Over the years, rain and frost had eroded the soil around the gnarled roots and gaps had formed. And according to the map of Rodrigo the Mouse, beneath that dead root ball lay the entrance to an unexplored tunnel system. Unexplored because the first expedition had never returned, which was supposed to investigate why people had been disappearing from this region recently. Wait a minute, and you're only telling me that now? Bifford wondered, drawing his magnificent one-handed sword made of marinium 4. The blade, adorned with unknown runes, was not glowing at the moment. And it would only do this, if a shapeshifter tried to sneak up on him again. Rodrigo grinned up at him shrewdly as he crouched to examine the ground more closely. What's the fun in life if one always knew everything beforehand, Senor Bifford? By the way, I can only see few human footprints here, all leading in the same direction. None come towards us. The lost expedition, I suppose. They now slowly and carefully followed the path in the direction of the tree stump, and the closer the two companions got to it, the taller first the fir trees became, then the few blades of grass and ferns, and finally even the trampling path itself. In the middle of a wide road strewn with pine needles, Bifford and Rodrigo now walked towards a hill of roots rising like a fortress. And from a mouse's perspective, it was easy to see that in the shadow of a twisting root, there existed a gateway to the underworld of the continent Akingolin. Nothing moved on the surface. They stopped at the end of the street, where it opened onto an unvegetated forecourt around the rootstock. Bifford and Rodrigo waited, looking towards the entrance to see if anything or anyone would come towards them. Let's see what's in there. A fox's den, perhaps, Rodrigo said after a while, with a shrug. Now he also grabbed the two-handed war axe, which he had carried on his back until now. They leisurely walked over to the tree stump. Side by side. The man and the mouse. Brothers in fantasy arms. Together they walked through the dark entrance, which seemed to be of natural origin. As their eyes had adjusted to the semi-darkness, it turned out that the cave must be the nest of an animal that had been abandoned some time ago. It looked like the whole cave was a single room about 15 meters high, with roots as thick as an arm hanging from the ceiling. In the approximate center of this entrance hall were signs of what had once dwelt here. A piled-up circle made mostly of smaller tree trunks and dry branches, but also a few human bones. On closer inspection, the two adventurers discovered a pair of forearm-length feathers of a species they did not know and a dark niche, which turned out to be a passage branching off from the main cave. Bifford surmised that the feathered creature, now absent, had not been able to enter this lower part of the cave. Whatever it was big enough to carry people away. Rodrigo agreed with his friend, taking one of the torches that was tucked into the outside pocket of Bifford's backpack and lighting it. He took another close look at the abandoned nest. Then he handed the torch to Bifford and said gravely, "As I thought, Senor Bifford. Judging by the excavation work, this is clearly the entrance to an ancient fox's den. But there is no evidence that a fox has lived here in recent years. Such as hair or paw prints. If no one has been down there for a long time, we might just find some mineral resources, useful roots, or rare insects." With tacit agreement, they set off. Rodrigo, His face determined and his axe shouldered, led the way deeper and deeper into the burrow. Bifford followed close behind, torch raised and sword drawn. Ever further they followed the winding and branching tunnels, but the adventurers found nothing apart from a few weak poisonous spiders the size of a giant pumpkin. Bifford wouldn't even have needed to stain his blade with the stinking black spider blood if it weren't for the sake of the exercise. Rodrigo could easily have done it by himself and with one hand, if only he'd had a smaller weapon with him. The muscular, battle-hardened mouse was used to far worse things and seemed to be a bit disappointed himself. He spoke out what they both were thinking. Not much to be found, under the ground. I could have left the heavy plate armor at home if I had known it would be such a child's play. There's just one other passage we haven't checked yet. Bifford had no idea where they actually were, but Rodrigo's rodent instincts never failed him in situations like this. Alright, let's take a look at that and then go back to the surface. We shouldn't neglect the flight speed of time, down here in the dark. Not that we'll be home late for dinner. Bifford suggested a bit listlessly. When they reached the tunnel, they found it to be a dead end. Bifford was about to walk away and return to the burrow entrance. Come on, Rodrigo. There's nothing left to do for us here. Perhaps we can find a clue to the identity of the victims among the bones in the nest. An engraved chain, or a ring. I don't think the feathered beast abducted them for their jewelry. But Rodrigo, the white mouse, didn't move. He narrowed his eyes and stared into the semi-darkness. He had sensed something incomprehensible to the human senses. A tiny breeze had made his whiskers vibrate and this had transmitted to his sensitive nose. He could determine exactly that this draft came from the front. And this in a cave with only one entrance, in which there shouldn't be any drafts at all. The mouse explained it to the human. The two now approached the wall at the end of the corridor and began to examine it more closely. It was unusual that it was made of rock and not of compacted earth like the rest of the fox's den. Bifford let his fingers run over the surface and could see just as little from up close as from 3 meters away. It was a solid wall. But of course Rodrigo could perceive much more with his highly sensitive mouse senses. He started sniffing the corners. Right, then left. He returned to the right corner and got down on all fours. What's the matter, Rodrigo? Found something? Bifford's tension was evident in his voice. I'm not sure, Rodrigo answered. He moved a few steps away from the wall and said, "Step back, amigo." Light on his feet like a dancer, he took 2 steps towards the wall and jumped into the air. In mid-flight he spun around his own axis and kicked his paw against the wall. To Bifford's amazement, the wall cracked where his companion's foot had struck it. The crack spread over the entire stone wall and with a deafening noise the wall collapsed into the corridor. Rodrigo was swallowed up in a cloud of dust and barely just managed to jump out of it with a backflip with which he had pushed himself off the wall. While the stones still fell to the ground, Rodrigo landed on all fours on his knees in front of Bifford. He kept one hand pressed on his upper arm and his face twitched. Blood ran out from under his fingers. "Are you all right?" asked Bifford, seriously concerned for the injured companion. Rodrigo stifled a groan and hissed between his teeth, "Sure, Senor Bifford, don't worry. I am a man and not a mouse. It will heal again. It's only a scratch." As the blown-up dust settled and the view cleared, the two studied what had come to light. A second, light gray stone wall had appeared behind the first rock wall. It seemed to be much harder and didn't look like compacted earth. The material was completely smooth and appeared to have been cast in one piece. In the middle of this strange wall was a metal door with a circular viewing window. Rusty screws adorned the frame of the window and the door itself also had dents and scratches that had begun to rust. Rodrigo and Bifford cautiously approached the thick-walled glass window to look through. The corridor continued on the other side of the door. And they could only see a few meters before the way turned around a corner. Though, it was no longer a crude fox tunnel driven into the Earth's crust, but a seamless corridor built of small bricks. The two adventurers consulted and came to the conclusion that this corridor resembled a simple sewer system. Possibly beyond the funereal forest there was a village nearby that Bifford and Rodrigo didn't know about, and the fox's den had led to a branch of its sewage system. Or it was perhaps the forgotten temple of an ancient civilization, which had been technically far superior to ours. Everything seemed old and yet, like from a more modern time. This was already evident from the locking mechanism of the metal door. It consisted of a hand wheel with 5 spokes, which was so big that one had to turn it with both hands so that a large number of bolts inside the door sunk noiselessly into the door frame. And halfway to the corner of the corridor was another oddity. A flameless square lamp that illuminated the short stretch of way ahead. For no apparent reason, the small, matte white cube, in a lattice box hung with cobwebs, emitted an even glow. The two couldn't see much more from here. Of course they had become curious, and so the two companions entered the strange corridor. It was quiet. As they cautiously peered around the corner, the sounds of battle erupted and they saw another human-sized, muscular white mouse.
Rodent Rampage! Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights! Genetically modified battle mites! Eating pizza on mountain bikes! Come and join the righteous fight! Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights! Silently creeping through the night! Climbing walls and leaping roofs! Make the enemies look like goofs! TMRK! Let's go, battle boys! Hey! Rodent Rampage! Rodent Rampage! Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights! Super suplexes and twisted out thighs! Crying buttercups, bent bone and muscle! Flying uppercuts and all hustle and bustle! Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights! Standing strong and shining bright! Witness it, they're taking flight! Heroes of suburban midnight! TMRK! All night and day! Hey! Rodent Rampage! Rodent Rampage! Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights! Standing taller than the Dolomites! Popping dominoes and rolling dice! Stopping fraudsters from voting twice! Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights! Paragliding over eroded light! We can't deny her of necromantic rights! Beware entire population zombifies! TMRK! We rock the sewers! Hey! Rodent Rampage! Rodent Rampage!
The battlemouse was standing with his back to Bifford and Rodrigo, taking cover behind a square concrete block. Bullets smashed against it, ricocheting in all directions, tearing fist-sized holes in the walls of the vastly widening corridor. It was the entrance to a large, underground machine room, a manufacturing hall, or something similar. The arrangement of the machine blocks, generators, and industrial-looking production units, formed winding corridors open to the top, in which tiny lights blinked. Clouds of steam and smoke hung over individual areas of the sparsely lit room. Bifford and Rodrigo continued to advance, in a hunched-over posture and pressed against the wall. They crouched behind the encircled battlemouse, who, without looking, fired an entire magazine around the corner, out of a submachine gun, which he had captured from the enemy. Bifford noted that this mouse had mottled gray fur on the exposed neck and shoulder areas of the dark hardened leather polymer armor. Light gray and dark gray round patches in white fur. A shower of small stones, dust and broken glass fell on the three. Bifford remembered. That had to be Vincenzo. In his hands he now held two short, straight daggers with horn-shaped, bladed parry bars, which were also suitable for stabbing and cutting. A dagger, like a trident. Yo! The third mouse yelled between two explosions and turned to them as if he had been expecting the two adventurers. Out of red eyes, Vincenzo looked at them attentive through the sight holes of his blindfold, which was also red, and asked, "Have you deactivated the fuses and activated the detonator, boys?" Bifford looked questioningly at Rodrigo and Rodrigo nodded, grinning maliciously. "Yes." Bifford yelled through the raging inferno of impacting projectiles around them. "Yes, we certainly did. I guess. Top. Then we can finally do the shoo and buzz off from here," replied the battlemouse with the red eyes, pulled out the pin of a hand grenade and threw it around the corner of the cover. He called after it, "Watch out. Hot potato." A deafening bang and frightened screams rang out from the center of the elongated and hardly surveyable hall. "Where have you left Diodoro, Vinny?" Rodrigo asked calmly. Diodoro was the fourth in the fellowship. He wore a purple blindfold and carried a two-handed steel-core hardwood quarterstaff on his back. The weapon this mouse had specialized in, featured extendable blades at both ends. And could also be halved, turning a 2-meter quarterstaff into two short sticks. Diodoro also had white fur and black eyes, just like Rodrigo. Vincenzo replied, "I don't know, bro. I went totally into battle frenzy and probably he just couldn't keep up with the action anymore. He must still be in there somewhere. Over at the miracle powder filling plant. Or got stuck in the biochemistry lab." "All right," said Rodrigo, who was wearing a light blue blindfold and looked calmly at his wristwatch. "We probably have to extract him quickly before the cheese hits the fan and everything flies around our heads." He grabbed the weapon holster on his back and pulled out two slim objects. These were so-called buchucks. A kind of flail, which was not intended for grain. Two 40-centimeters bamboo sticks, as thick as a sword hilt and filled with lead, were connected by a hand-length chain. Deftly, Rodrigo whirled one of the buchucks around, so fast that the air hissed, while he held the second one in his fist. Bifford looked down at himself. He too had claws, hairless hands and feet, white fur on his arms and a hairless mouse tail. Crossed on his back, he carried two katanas, which he probably intended to wield with one hand. His body was clad in a modernly designed, leather-style knight's armor, which exposed his muscular upper arms and was made of ultra-lightweight, carbon fiber-reinforced polymer slats. His face was also hidden by a narrow strip of fabric with viewing holes, making it partially unrecognizable. Bifford's color was dark green and like the others he wore bandanas of the same color tied around his knees and elbows. Each of them wore extremely trendy cut, puncture-proof tactical combat sneakers with indestructible air cushions, in their individual identification colors. Green, red, violet and light blue. TMRK, hey. Now he fully remembered. They were the Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights. And it was the year 893 CT. After decades of pollution, social unrest and political tensions, the world teetered on the brink of chaos. Especially in this rough part of the continent Akingolinian, the dome of the cheese was all fogged up. Bifford looked around frantically as the hail of bullets subsided. The door behind them, through which he and Rodrigo had entered this production hall from the tunnel system under the stump, was gone. The corridor simply continued in that direction and there was no sign that there had ever been a wall there. Where had they gotten themselves into, this time? Craning his neck, he peered around the cover. But Rodrigo pulled him back on the nape of his armor just before a bullet whizzed past his head. With that he said, "Hold your radish low, Biff. Vinny. Listen up. We stay down and sneak up on them. Stay hidden between the machine blocks and take on the members of the Handgang clan in small groups. Like so, we slowly chew them up and ultimately. Ka-blam. Frontal attack, head first through the middle. All right, compadres. Right. Now, Rodent Rampage. Rodent Rampage. Vincenzo also shouted. Rodrigo and Vincenzo immediately charged forward crouched, despite the high lead content of the air. Bifford drew his 2 katanas and also left cover, muttering to himself in surprise, Rodent Rampage. Rolling across the floor, doing saltos and backflips and running along the walls, they soon had the enemy's superior numbers in dire straits. Again and again they swooped down, crawled under the machines and attacked from ambush, or duped the enemy with daring diversionary maneuvers. The wildly firing opponents seemed to be running out of ammunition, while the Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights' conventional weapons continued to dish out with merciless reliability. Only about 20 hooded figures, which belonged to a private army called the Handgang clan, now gathered in front of the security gate, which led into the filling plant. To get a better overview of the situation, Bifford climbed onto one of the engine blocks and from there somersaulted to the railing of a walkway leading around the hall. He swung over it and let himself drop flat on the grid floor. Rodrigo ran diagonally below him toward a stack of metal cover flaps in the center of the hall and ducked behind it. Meanwhile, Vincenzo skillfully leapt and spiraled through the air from one fabrication station to the next, drawing the enemy crossfire on him. Undeterred by the storm of bullets, he too took position on the far side of the hall. He found cover behind a concrete pillar and immediately his raspy voice rang in the button in Bifford and Rodrigo's ears. "One more round on the wild mouse for those toys, then we're going underground, boys. I'm in position. Over." Bifford also heard Rodrigo's voice. "Let no one escape, so no one can follow us." Over. And Bifford confirmed, "Target in sight. I'll throw a flash grenade at 3 and then you." The 8 meters wide roller shutter was ripped open from the inside by a massive explosion, and all the guards who had gathered in front of it were blown away by the blast. Strike. Over. Bifford finished his sentence. Through the surging flames and a thick wall of smoke, leapt a black-clad shadow with a purple face mask. As soon as he touched the ground, the figure executed a sweeping swing with a long quarterstaff and yelled, "Rodent Rampage." But there were no more opponents on their feet that Diodoro could have flattened. Bifford, Rodrigo and Vincenzo emerged from their cover and briefed the missing comrade in arms of the situation. The timer in the opponent's control center was set and continuously running backwards. As it seemed, their contrahents had noticed by now that intruders were present and a shrill alarm signal began to sound with a regularly rising and falling. The Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights didn't have much time left to evacuate the factory complex. They began to look around between the machines and the unconscious opponents for a way out. The opponent this time, the Eviscerator and his private army, the Handgang clan. They were Panikai Niiziku's henchmen, better known at the time as the Eviscerator. He had returned, once again, in robotic armor, forged from ancient blades and pumped full of performance-enhancing and aggression-raising substances. The Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights still didn't know how he'd done it, but he'd resurrected and gathered an army of thugs, criminals, and other scum around him. They had all followed him willingly and obediently, since only the law of the strongest counted in their twilight world. And Panikai Niiziku was just that. Superhumanly strong. Merciless and megalomaniac, but more than fair to his own employees. Fresh from the grave, his heart as black as a millennial egg. His body genetically engineered and improved, Panikai Niiziku found himself on a journey of self-discovery of the destructive kind. Whoever stood in his way was destroyed. But those who submitted to him were made stronger. The Eviscerator spared no expense in professionally training his retainers and providing them with high-tech equipment and firearms. The only requirement was that they became part of his Handgang clan and submitted to his command. At the end of the day, they all had the same goal. Namely, that the business in the underworld was quiet and profitable. No one who had dared standing in the path of the eviscerator had survived. Not the mayor and not the police. And so they had let it be over time. The eviscerator's handgang clan had now seized control of an entire city. But in a few minutes his reign of terror would end. The 4 rodent knights had fought hard, had breached into his headquarters and defeated him in a seemingly endless final battle. The rodent knights had dragged the eviscerator's unconscious body out of the fractured exoskeleton of his bladed armor, and had tied him with steel chains to an acid tank at the narcotics and biological warfare factory. Then they had planted a whole lot of explosives tightly around him. The 4 battle mice would never allow the eviscerator to take over their favorite city and possibly poison the entire continent Akingolin. After a sticky situation like this, one of the rodent knights would usually say something cool like, "Hey, that was hyper-rustically rocked." Or, "Savage strike of destruction, yo." Maybe a casual rodent rampage would be collectively proclaimed. But this time it was Bifford who commented on the past fight. "Yes, brothers. We sent them straight to the mouse, Oleum." Now all the teenage mutant rodent knights had to do was escape the evil drug and biological weapons factory complex that all of New Lorndom had been transformed into. It didn't take long for the 4 white giant mice to gain access to the sewers with the help of Vincenzo's pen-shaped pocket welder. The lock on the sewer cover, in a corner of the production hall, offered little resistance. Unseen, the 4 disappeared into the underground and unerringly followed the sewers to a nearby shaft. Once there, Rodrigo checked his wristwatch again and announced, 4.5 minutes to go, rodent knights. Hurry up now. All 4 now picked up the gear they had deposited here in the run-up to the mission while infiltrating the eviscerator's base. These were rocket backpacks, so-called jetpacks, which would carry the rodent knights through the narrow tunnels of the sewage system at a breakneck speed. The rodent knights hovered in place, engines roaring. It would be a relatively short flight through the New Lorndom underground, back to their hidden lair. They pulled the goggles over their blindfolds and floated side by side in a line, in front of the entrance to the next corridor. Now Bifford challenged his mouse brothers to a daring race. Last one to reach the safe house cleans out all the high-compression impulse fusion engines. It starts at 3, 1. Rodrigo, hovering in their midst, yelled, "It certainly won't be me this time." As he pressed the firing button of his jetpack, he dropped a flash grenade at the same moment. Even before the grenade exploded in a rather harmless flash of light, Rodrigo had already shot several meters into the sewer shaft and shouted back over his shoulder, "Say cheese, you blind moles." Bifford, Vincenzo, and Diodoro quickly gathered themselves and cursed wildly, "No, you're the brass mole. Get him." And so the wild chase began, with Rodrigo in the lead and a good 40 meters head start. Bifford and Vincenzo pursued him like his shadows, racing closely along the sewer pipes and past obstacles. Despite everything, Diodoro did not allow himself to be rushed and preferred a safe flying style. Anyway, the jetpacks were all exactly the same speed. And as expected, about 2 minutes after they had lifted off the ground, the deep rumble of a chain reaction of massive explosions began to shake the underground. The teenage mutant rodent knights were about to rock this town. The eviscerator's narcotics and biological weapons factory was history. Without its head, the serpent would soon die and lose its grip on the city of New Lorndom. A fire roller roared through the sewers and approached the 3 battle mice from behind. The wall of flames slowly caught up with them. With maximum forward tilt and their jetpacks thrusters cranked to full throttle, they narrowly escaped the radius of the rampant destruction. Only 3/4 of an hour later they landed unharmed and triumphant in front of the hidden gate of their animal shelter. Their dojo and home in one was located a few kilometers outside of the city limits. They had once moved into a collapsed mineshaft in this area, which they had connected to the endless underground network of sewage pipes by digging their own tunnel. Actually, it was their sensei who had found the underground lair. Over the years, the 4 had amassed all sorts of abandoned furniture and utensils they found around town and set up a cool and homely bachelor pad. The mouse pad. Diodoro, in his jet black armor and violet face mask, opened the hidden entrance gate with the secret numeric code, which activated an iris scanner that started a DNA analyzer. After the device had taken a marginal amount of his skin cells and compared it with the database, the gate opened from its center and both halves slid silently into the side walls. Bifford and Rodrigo walked past Diodoro and Vincenzo into the entrance hall to disable the automatic defense systems. When they got through a few more security doors to the actual base of the Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights, the sensei was already standing in the room behind the door and had been waiting for them. "You were late, my sons. Could you successfully complete the mission, Rodent Knights? Did you send Panikai Niiziku back to hell?" The slightly reproachful voice came from a peacock whose body alone was almost half the size of a battlemouse. The huge bird was old and wore a magnificent kimono of black silk embroidered with white lotus blossoms. His stilt legs were wrapped in yellow bandages and on his feet he wore house shoes specially made for him. The damp cold of the underground hiding place in the abandoned mine did him no good. His name was Monty Peacock, and when he fanned his wonderfully colorful wheel, he was almost 1 head taller than his 4 protégés. Beautiful and deceptive, he was far from just a harmless, brightly colored bird from some forest. "Yes, sensei," the 4 said respectfully, as if from one mouth and stood at attention. They reported to their teacher precisely what had happened at the Eviscerator's headquarters. The sensei patiently walked up and down in front of his students and listened to their reports with interest. Finally he summarized, "This is really extraordinary. What a malicious plan. Good. It is good that you have put an end to this, my brave rodent knights. If the world only knew about you, it would celebrate you. I am convinced of that." The peacock looked thoughtful as he continued after a short pause. "One cannot always be a shining hero, my sons. But one can always be a battlemouse. A hero's glory is temporary, but as a battlemouse one is born. And one always will be. Until death." The 4 students nodded solemnly and Bifford, moved by the teacher's wise words, murmured, "Yes, sensei. So true. Wow." The sensei nodded at him with a smile and then turned to the mouse with the red eyes. "Vincenzo, why don't you order us all a delicious pizza to celebrate the day?" When Vincenzo immediately wanted to run to the phone, the peacock raised the tip of his wing admonishingly and continued, "But not from the usual shop in New Lorndom, capiche? I don't want the narcotic fallout from Panikai Niiziku's chemical plant as a surprise ingredient on my pizza. Call the delivery guy from Pizza Vigilante, up in the north. As always, I'll have the salami pizza with extra pepperoni, but no pepper." Vincenzo proudly stuck out his chest, because when the sensei invited them to a round of pizza, it was truly a reason to celebrate. "Yes, sensei. A really wise decision. Fine. This concludes the briefing. Now be water, my friends, and flow away. Go play until dinner comes," said Monty the peacock, laughing. The 4 rodent knights breathed a sigh of relief. The sensei was pleased with their performance today. "Yes, sensei," they all said again politely and with one voice. Then they started joking, patting each other on the back and making their way to the armory. The rodent knights stripped off their jet black armor and washed down thoroughly before calling the pizza delivery guy on the illegally tapped phone line. Pizza was the rodent knights' main source of food and also their favorite. Vincenzo opted for a quattro formaggi with an additional 5th cheese. Rodrigo preferred his dish with ham, onion and mushroom. Diodoro daringly went for the pizza diavolo. Bifford usually ordered the folded calzone, but on that fateful day, feeling a little boisterous, he ordered a red giant sea snail margarita with onion and herb butter. Oh, you were wondering why the sensei is an oddly large peacock and not what pizza the Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights would order. Well, that all happened about 20 years ago. At that time, experiments were carried out in a top-secret biochemistry laboratory of the Greater Akingolinian Medicinal Products Syndicate. The syndicate was an amalgamation of almost all manufacturers of medicinal products and pharmaceuticals on the United Continent Akingolin, the so-called Greater Akingolin. The GAMP syndicate conducted experiments that would benefit the health and healing of the entire population of Greater Akingolin. A research institute in New Lorndom was mainly working on a serum that could stimulate human cells to regenerate and optimize their development. And of course cellular aging was seen as a disease that needed to be eradicated. Well, to a certain extent, the GAMP Syndicate Institute had succeeded. The PR department's benevolent theory was that in the event of a disease or viral epidemic, this serum would also automatically adapt to those pathogens and defeat the cause. In practice, however, the manufacturers clearly wanted to breed an invincible super soldier. A nearly immortal fighting machine that blindly obeyed every command and repaired itself when damaged. The Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights had discovered over the years that Panikai Niiziku had been the leader of one of the violent, insurgent warrior hordes that had brought down the Fongdu dynasty over 2,000 years ago. Because of his impressive fighting style with 3 swords at the same time, they had called him the Eviscerator even back then. And also because he had supposedly not been defeated by anyone for over 120 years. Some scrolls were found in his grave goods, in which the decisive clue to his legendary immortality was hidden. He had been a powerful war alchemist in that distant time, and had already developed the immortality serum for his own needs. Although he had only managed to create a single dose of the cell-regenerating mutagen once during his lifetime, by using his humble, antique laboratory equipment, the origins of the formula lived on within him. In his well-preserved, mummified corpse. Only the brain was missing and had been replaced by a round lump of mountain crystal. And so the Gamp Syndicate scientists had secretly cloned the warmonger from the past. Possibly the resurrected Panikai Niiziku could have shown a natural gift for chemistry and could have been spoken to personally about the research results that he had already acquired. He might have been able to make the serum himself using modern laboratory equipment. This was now the 3rd time that the scientists of the Gamp Syndicate had experimented with it and the Teenage Mutant Rodent Knights had had to intervene. Yet again they had apparently failed to extract the formula from Panikai Niiziku's blood. Mainly because the clone, as always, had no knowledge of his old life, only a vague idea of who he had been. A cruel warlord and shrewd businessman who, despite his poor knowledge, had no difficulties outwitting a few lab workers and guards. However, that didn't stop the greedy Gamp Syndicate from reproducing Panikai Niiziku over and over again. Just like the first 2 times, he'd broken free and let off steam all over town. This time he had even assembled a private army and conquered New Lorndom. The last time he'd just taken control of the lab and had attempted to clone himself in order to gain power. However, as the number of clones had increased, they fell victim to their own stupidity. For lack of time, instead of copying the original, the Eviscerator had reproduced the clones over and over again and multiplied them by themselves. They quickly had degenerated and even revolted against their original leader. It had ended in chaos, luckily with most of the 8,000 clones fighting against each other or falling victim to accidents. The Rodent Knights had had to clean up quite a bit of an imbroglio back then, but only on the site of the Research Institute. The very first attempt had served to recover the serum directly from the DNA of Panikai Niiziku's clone. And it had succeeded, to a very limited extent. However, the first Panikai Niiziku almost died in the process. He hadn't had any memories of the past either, and ended up running amok in the lab. At the same time, the scientists of the Gamp Syndicate had tested the original serum that they had extracted from the clone on animals because the existing dose would have been too small to be administered to humans. And animals, for some reason, had reacted much more sensitively to a smaller amount of the mutagen. Of course, the scientists had also been curious about what the serum would do to a genome other than that of humans. Also, they had been bored from waiting forever for the next clone to be completed and had nothing else to torment at that moment. Luckily for them, the local zoo had had to close down for lack of visitors. Because the holographic goggles that had been on sale that same year and were directly connected to the Conti net, had largely replaced the experience of actually going outside and doing something. So the Gamp Syndicate had bought some of the animals and randomly treated them with the mutagen solution designed to enhance their natural genetic structure. A buffalo, a giraffe, 2 hyenas, an alligator, a couple of pythons and even a swordfish had had to sacrifice themselves for the experiments. An old peacock and 3 white mice had also fallen into the hands of the Gamp Syndicate. And although it had only been a few months since they had been neighbors in their cages, it had felt like an eternity. Especially for the mice, who had known nothing but their incubator with the glass cover. Because the 3 had just been born in this laboratory. Presumably to be tortured to death for the good cause of designing a more effective and safer cotton swab. Or for developing shampoo that didn't burn so much when it got in the eyes. But why not just avoid getting shampoo in the eyes in the first place and not stick the cotton swab to where it hurts? But those were hardly the most urgent questions occupying the helpless pheasant-like chicken bird at that moment. After being treated with the serum, his most important and first two questions had been, who am I? And why can I suddenly think about that? Across the laboratory, where his glass prison cell stood against a wall, other animals had shared his fate. They were stored and used here like objects stacked on a wall shelf. Until they were disposed of. Through the transparent barrier of his cage door, the peacock could see a clipboard with papers. Symbols of the humans, he had seen on it. And he had been able to recognize himself reflected in the armored acrylic glass. Although he had assumed that he would probably be killed soon and had resigned himself to this fate, he had felt something close to joy. Even he had nothing to occupy himself within his cramped cell, he had been free. Free to think to wherever he wanted. He had only now really begun to understand the world, and every little detail had triggered new thoughts and feelings within him. Life, indeed the whole universe, had unfolded before his mind, in all its splendor, like his own iridescent plumage. Those symbols of the humans were bound to have a deeper meaning. It had not left him in peace, and he had started to listen carefully to the conversations of the scientists and to observe them. Exactly as they had studied him. The peacock's memory was extremely precise, even photographically accurate. And so, over time, he had figured out how they used the keyboards on their computers and learned to interpret the meaning of the symbols on the screens. The peacock had taught himself to read. And so he had been able to solve one of the mysteries in his environment. The symbols on the small sign on his transparent prison cell read, Pavo Christatus number 7. That must be the name of what I am. He had thought happily and, in a creative moment, had rearranged the letters into a new word that he felt more suitable for a colorful and versatile bird like himself. He had thought of Pack, Christ, or maybe Tatus. But then, for no apparent reason, he had chosen Monty. Monty Peacock. Because he'd loved the twisted melody that this name had produced when he'd first crooned it to himself in his native bird language. Monty had begun to imitate human sounds from memory and eventually also learned their language. But he hadn't let it show. He had long since figured out what was going on here. The scientists had wanted to breed him into a super soldier to send him to war. The peacock had observed the project manager closely as he paid special attention to the 3 white mice. Apparently all his hopes had been pinned on these 3 rodents. He had taken care of them like a father and talked to them lovingly in a soft voice. The wise peacock had learned a lot from the project manager, and a plan had begun to emerge. An escape plan. The man in the white lab coat had fed the young mice every morning from a small feeding bottle containing the last ration of serum available to the research institute. And then he had scratched the mice's stomachs. They had soon trusted him implicitly and had grown remarkably fast. Much faster than the average mouse would have done. Their DNA had begun to mutate, just as the scientists had intended. They had grown bigger, stronger and more intelligent than any other of their own species. They were alpha battle mice. Monty Peacock had immediately begun to communicate with them at night, first by whistling simple and later more complex songs to them. Curious, they had crawled closer to the pane, had sat up on it and listened. It had been only a children's game for the mutant mice. But Monty had trained their brains, and soon he had secretly taught them the human language as well. He had also given the 3 youngsters their current names so that they would no longer attach any importance to the slave names which the prison guards had forced upon them. It had only been numbers. Monty had given them the most beautiful names he had known. Rodrigo, Diodoro and Vincenzo. He'd read them on square, flat boxes that had smelled incredibly good. The scientists had eaten from these boxes right in front of the animals in order to torture and humiliate them, knowing that they would never escape their cage and be able to grab a slice of that irresistible pizza. Not in their whole life. These white boxes with colorful prints had become a symbol of the peacock's resistance. Owning them and eating from them was synonymous with freedom and independence. Pizza meant life. Just as the 4 inmates of the research laboratory had developed a sophisticated escape plan, which would have involved a pizza delivery, the first cloned Panikai Niiziku had run amok in the laboratory. In his mental confusion he had started shooting around wildly and caused a widespread fire. And thus had brought the entire project to failure. Monty Peacock, who had also been affected by the serum, had immediately started picking at his prison window. He'd been amazed himself when he had found that he was actually strong enough to pierce holes in his prison's armored acrylic glass door. He had hopped out of his cell and flapped in a downward curve over the flames that were just spreading from the door into the room. He had landed on the table with the incubator of the 3 young mutant mice and freed them. By now they had become a kind of family to the peacock, and he had carried them on his back to a barred ventilation shaft in the wall of the laboratory. To do so, he jumped from one table to the next in long leaps so that the ventilation shaft could be reached. Monty had also punctured this prison door with his beak until it finally opened and revealed the way. The shaft had led downwards and Monty had let himself fall with the mice on his back. He had slowed down the descent a little with his wings until the shaft had curved and continued to run in a horizontal direction. Above them the conflagration had raged and the peacock had quick-wittedly pecked up another cover flap. This had given the fugitives access to the basement of the research institute. Well, how they finally had made it down to the sewers, Monty Peacock would have preferred not to be able to remember. If the 4 had not already been mutated by the serum, they could hardly have survived the journey through the toxic sewage sludge under New Lorndom unscathed. And so the 4 had disappeared underground as the only survivors for the time being and nobody knew anything about it. They had escaped. The peacock, the eldest of the group whose mutation had progressed furthest, had led the others and they had moved into their current lair. There the serum had developed its full effect while the mice had continued to grow. Within 3 years they had reached an enormous size and had taken on the proportions of an adult human. They had begun to walk upright and learn to talk. As they had settled into the abandoned mine and the mutation process had stabilized, they began taking shorter trips to collect useful items that the humans had thrown away. One day they had found a whole cardboard box full of old books and among them there had been 2 books on martial arts. Armed and unarmed. Full of curiosity, Monty Peacock had devoured the knowledge of the art of self-defense. The 3 young battle mice had watched him with fascination during his daily physical exercises and immediately imitated his movements. That's how the teenage mutant rodent knights had come into being and Monty had become their sensei, who trained and disciplined them mercilessly. But he had also always been their loving father and caring friend. And shortly afterwards Bifford Crownswood, who was a childhood friend of Rodrigo's, had joined them. Totally logical. They were the TMRK. They were young, groovy and cool at the same time. The whole city lay at their feet and they were free to explore it, as long as no one saw them. Speeding through the sewers on jet skis, rescuing the metropolis from evil, riding down the stairs in pairs on a mountain bike, or jumping off a skyscraper with a parachute. They had been there and had done that. Rodent Rampage. And so, back to more important things in life. Like melt in the mouth, steaming hot pizza. The Rodent Knights had just ordered some. From Pizza Vigilante, up north. A salami pizza with extra pepperoni, but no pepper. A quattro formaggi with an additional 5th cheese. Once pizza with ham, mushrooms and onions. One devilish hot pizza diavolo. And a margarita with red giant sea snails, onions and herb butter. No lemonade with it. Generally, they only drank milk and herbal tea. And the order was an adventure of itself each time they wanted to remain anonymous in the underground in this modern age. And so the teenage mutant rodent knights would usually have the courier to take the delivery to an abandoned house on the outskirts of New Lorndom. Together they had come up with the clever scheme of just pretending to live there. First they attached magnetic name tags that said Mr. T. Murrow, Knight, on the old mailbox and under the doorbell. They also lit some candles behind the windows before the delivery guy arrived. On the phone, they insisted that the goods should be placed at the front door and deposited the money under the doormat. Bifford and Rodrigo could already smell the fresh pizza. A bell rang and the door of the scarecrower's shop slammed shut. Suddenly Bifford Crownswood was alone in his shop and fell silent.
Ducksons&Dragoon. 1. Quest for the holy snail.